My interest in basically in those small countries caught between empires.
I was arrested along with a partner.
That Taiwanese feel themselves a nation on their own land.
To have any support, I'm very, very happy and very proud.
This is the story of how Lithuania became Taiwan's little big best friend. In September 2023, more than 300 Taiwanese people gathered in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, for an annual worldwide congress. It was the largest gathering of Taiwanese people in Lithuania to date.
That's also why we choose Lithuania to be our venue, because we think that it's the time to officially introduce both countries.
We are going to run. There is a World Lithuanian Running event. Gerai! Visi važiuojam!
Lietuva! Lietuva!
Už Lietuvą! We are small countries and we like the support. Small countries like to support each other.
My name is Marius Jovaiša. I am Lithuanian photographer, publisher, entrepreneur, author. Lithuanian politicians decided that we will make the step of opening a Taiwanese representation office using the name Taiwan rather than Taipei, which is the case everywhere else in the world. And this action created an incredible explosion of interest in Lithuania about Taiwan and in Taiwan about Lithuania.
My interest in basically in those small countries caught between empires. I found out that, a very fundamental similarity between Taiwan and Lithuania, which is occupation, the experience of occupation. A small country or a people caught between great powers. Maybe it's not exactly the same as the Soviet occupation, but the fact that both of Soviet Union and KMT came from without this, the place, were the same. They were foreign regime or regime from, externally. I think this basic fact are similar.
I'm Minzy Chen. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm currently the president for FAPA, which is Formosan Association for Public Affairs. We have 40 years in the making, right? So we are all the American citizens trying to do grassroots advocacy for Taiwan. So learning this support, especially they have a representative office called Taiwan Representative Office in this capital city. That is a big deal. In Huapa, we promote that name for our embassy, de facto embassy in United States. We want to call it Taiwan Representative Office there. But they are the first in the world. They supported that and really make the difference. And we really appreciate that. And so I'm here totally just for showing this support.
As part of the conference in Vilnius, Taiwanese author Wu Mingyi was honored with a plaque on Literature Street, where famous writers have a special artwork reflecting their connection to the city and Lithuania displayed on a wall.
Oh yeah, this is the flag. This is actually one of my friend gave me from the youth hostel here because I stay there. And this one, I bought it myself. So this is, I want to show that Taiwan and Lithuania are, united here. In Taiwan, we're very isolated. And anyone who support us out of the reason of supporting human rights and democracy, it's make us really good friends.
Both countries know what it's like to live under a dictatorship. Taiwan experienced one of the most extended periods of martial law in history, 38 years under Kuomintang rule.
I was arrested along with a partner because the Kuomintang regime at the time didn't want us. And the person who arrested me was actually a captain of the police. He is now the presidential candidate in Taiwan for the KMT party. I was in prison because of national security law and sedition.
This was around the time Lithuania left the Soviet Union in 1990.
Tank-led paratroopers struck at both the capital's transmission tower and broadcast center.
When I heard about the Soviet tanks driving through the TV tower, killing Lithuanians, I told my wife, we have to go and support the Lithuanians' rallies.
This also makes us very sensitive to bullying, because when we see that someone bigger is trying to intimidate, to terrorize someone smaller, who is not necessarily at fault of anything. The smaller guy's only fault is that he is smaller. But we also know that this is not something to be ashamed of. Lithuania is also a small country, but back in the 90s we were able to start the process of dismantling Soviet Union. What happened in 1991, almost a year after Lithuania declared independence from Russia, Russian authorities, on the orders of Mikhail Gorbachev, sent here the army, the military, to organize a coup. I am not sure I have ever met a Taiwanese person in my life, so that seems quite exciting.
Eileen and Leila have been living in Lithuania for a few years.
Pretty much Landsbergis was a leader of a National Assembly that declared independence of Lithuania from Russian occupation. And before that he was also an intellectual, one of the founders of Sąjūdis. It was this intellectual movement that wanted reforms. So at first they wanted reforms inside of the boundaries, but then they saw that under occupation you can not make any reforms that last and make any sense. So the National Assembly decided to adopt independence.
Inside, the democratically elected government of President Landsbergis tried to carry on. Landsbergis called on the world to pay attention.
I may correct a little bit this vision that Lithuania was standing against Russia. No, Lithuania was standing for itself. It is for Russia to decide, is Russia going against Lithuania or not? China and Taiwan are two different things. Of course they can attack, they may destroy, they can occupy. That is Stone Age. And Putin, maybe the Emperor of Beijing, they would like to get the world back to Stone Age, because they have a very big stone, not in a hand only. They have the stone in their heart.
Lithuania was quite, they're very gutsy, they have guts. Lithuania is really a very special case, given its special history, historical experience, and its, courage to fight against this, Soviet invasion. And
to be brave and clear and insist on clear mind of Taiwanese nation. Let Taiwanese feel themselves a nation on their own land.
My God, it's splendid. It's extraordinary. Strength and brevity are both, two noble qualities of humankind, right, in general.
To have any support, I'm very, very happy and very proud of Lithuania that stands up against China.
I'm really happy. I am half Lithuanian now, I consider myself. So, of course, this is really good news for me. I would say it's a brave move. I agree with Eileen.
In our region, with our history of centuries of being occupied by Russia and so on, we have very strong feelings about nations' right to self-determination.
In December 2020, Lithuania appointed a new prime minister, Ingrida Šimonytė. As soon as she took office, she pledged that her country would support Taiwan. In just a few days, it will be 3 years since two small countries entered into an unlikely friendship. Lithuania, a country of less than 3 million people that shook the Soviet Empire, has extended its hand to Taiwan and now faces China's anger.
Because of the COVID, and Lithuanian people decided that it's time for Lithuania to help Taiwan, because due to political reason and pressure from China, Taiwan had problem getting access to vaccines, COVID vaccines. And Lithuania was one of the first countries to donate, I think more than 100,000 or maybe up to 200,000 doses of vaccine to Taiwan.
I believe if there's enough countries unite together and don't depend on China that much, I would feel this is a good chance for Taiwan to finally live without threat. Yeah, because for me, I don't know, I'm like a regular, normal person. I'm not doing anything super magnificent in my life. It's how I grew up, just knowing Taiwan is a free country, and we don't have any bad intention towards any other country. So being treated like this, it makes me feel bad.
In times of Russian occupation, we also felt the same, and also this treatment of someone not based on any merit, but just based on the circumstances they were born into, is quite horrible. We do hope that this will inspire the world to be braver and to do the right thing.
Do you think you'll come back?
Yes.
Although the starting point is this vaccine diplomacy, but at the end, it's way, way beyond that. It's a forge of values, a forge of friendships.
It's very important for them because it's good for their body.
Lithuania is opening its lasers showroom in Taipei.
Those companies, when they produce their products, they need laser.
It's a joint venture between Lithuanian startup and Taiwanese technology company.